Good morning, Facebook. Today is April 10th, 2020. It is 11:55 a.m. Pacific Daylight Time, and here we go. So the first thing I want to say is that there was some really weird glitches in the live stream yesterday, which frustrated me quite a bit because I felt like yesterday was actually a pretty good broadcast. I had a lot of interaction with people, a lot of people commenting during the stream, giving me ideas of things to think about. And it seemed like it streamed live pretty well, but then afterwards, when it was processing to be viewed later, I would open up my phone and I was taking Eddie out for a walk, and I would periodically check my phone while I was walking around, and my phone would tell me that I was still broadcasting live, not from the phone, but from elsewhere. But I don't know. Eventually, everything settled down, and when I went back to view the video, it was precisely as long as it should have been. Had to sort of shut all my devices down and log out of Facebook to make sure that there wasn't some glitch that was causing my feed to register as still active, even though it wasn't. But eventually, that resolved itself. I'm assuming that with the enormous volume of people who were using online resources during the lockdown, that we can expect there to be some glitches in the system. So, be that as it may, everything appears to be up and running now. So I'm going to keep today a little shorter than yesterday. Yesterday ended up being over 42 minutes long, and there was a lot of information and a lot of random rants and vamps and tangents that happened. So today I'm going to back off of that just a little bit, but I want to focus on a few basic core figures. Let's start with some of the numbers. As of today, the United States is reporting 488,980 positive or confirmed cases. And today, as of today, our death count is at 18,009. Let's look at that in context with the projections, because this was supposed to be, according to what was stated at one of the various briefings of the coronavirus task force at the White House, this was supposed to be hell week, right? This was when everything was really supposed to peak. This is when it was supposed to be at its worst and everything was just going to be horrible. We were looking at projected figures of between 120 and 240,000 fatalities. And this was the week when everything was supposed to be so bad. And then, as I mentioned yesterday, that figure was revised down to around 80, which then was revised down to around 60. But the total number of fatalities that we're looking at as of today, Friday, the 10th of April, in the midst of what was supposed to be the very worst peak moment for the effect of COVID-19, we're looking at less than a third of what was projected, 18,009. I'm not trying to water down the gravity on a human level of 18,009 deaths, only to illustrate that it is far lower than the numbers that are being given to us. And the numbers are coming from the coronavirus task force. We've got Dr. Birx, we've got Dr. Fauci, and we've got their models, we've got their predictions, and we've got everything that they're telling us that we need to be expecting. And it is the information that is coming to us from this team of people which has led to the decision to institute this national lockdown, which as of now is supposed to go, at least in the state of Washington, our stay-at-home order is supposed to last through the 4th of May. As I've also pointed out in the past, other states are looking even further out. For instance, Virginia has a lockdown until, the 10th of June, I want to say. Pretty crazy. I didn't look at statewide figures today. I guess I can look that up pretty easily if need be, but something I wanted to talk about first. I touched on China yesterday. Their figures as of today, 81,970 positive or confirmed cases, with a total mortality rate 4.06%. They've experienced 3,306 fatalities due to coronavirus to date. We strongly believe that China had an outbreak of coronavirus that goes back a lot further than the January date at which point we confirmed our first case here in the United States. Some people believe that it began back in October, in which case it's been 6 months. I was looking at a linear graph of China's positive or confirmed cases. They leveled out over a month ago. I remember commenting on this broadcast that China was looking at 81,000 deaths, and at the time that I did so, they were by far the worst affected country in the world. Their numbers have hardly moved since then. They're still less than 82,000 total confirmed cases, as compared with the United States approaching the 500,000 point. 500,000 in a country whose population is only 23.6% the population of China. I went and got the specifics of that. Let me just point it out with respect to the actual numbers. The population of the United States currently is sitting at 327,200,000 people. China is looking at 1,386,000. I'm sorry, 1,386,000,000 people. They have over 4 times the amount of people we have. And yet, in the United States, we have 6 times the number of positive or confirmed cases of COVID-19. They have only 1/6 of the infection rate that we have, and yet they have over 4 times the population that we have, and their numbers, at least according to information that they are releasing, have not increased appreciably in over a month. Just think about that. So many more people, so much more population density, and a lot of criticism aimed at them for the way that they handled this, especially with respect to their transparency. They're sort of in cahoots with the World Health Organization and their Director General. A lot of criticism for the way that they've been handling it, and the numbers that they are reporting are really optimistic. They've really flattened off and life is returning to normal according to what they're reporting to us. One more time, just for the sake of being thorough, China has 81,970 confirmed cases. The United States has 488,980. We have 6 times more cases than them, and they have over 4 times as many people as us. And they've been dealing with this a lot longer than we have, as far as we know. And that makes me want to examine the possibility that we've actually had coronavirus in the United States for a lot longer than we thought. I believe it was, January the 21st, when we had our first positive or confirmed case in the United States. What if coronavirus has actually been here a lot longer, like all the way back into last year? How do we know? It was weird. The day after Christmas, I went to work even though I wasn't feeling well, and that proved to be a huge mistake because I ended up having to walk off of the floor in the middle of a business transaction, and I puked my guts out in the break room sink. One of our employees, our operations manager, happened to be walking past the break room door and see me hunched over the sink just in the throes of agony, puking my guts out. And of course, I went home, and I didn't come back to work for a couple days. But what was weird is that less than 3 weeks later, I came down with another illness. So this would have put it approximately, I don't know, I suppose it was somewhere between the 15th and the 20th of January. So right before we had our first positive or confirmed case in the United States, there was something going around where I was working, and it was completely different in nature from the stomach bug that I had the day after Christmas. Completely different. It was the loss of voice. It was the loss of, it was a fever. It was coughing a lot. I was absolutely miserable, and it was one of the worst such illnesses that I've had. So, how possible or likely is it that we've had coronavirus in the United States for longer by a significant margin than we assumed? And that a lot of people have already experienced it and gotten over it and developed antibodies? And if that's the case, how much of an overreaction are the current national mitigation requirements? These are all questions that bear a certain scrutiny. So, well, I've already got a number of comments on the live stream. Let me examine them for just a second. Okay. Well, I'll let the comments speak for themselves for now. There's a couple other things I want to get to. For example, yesterday, I was wondering aloud why it is that Germany has experienced such a lower rate of mortality than other places in the world, especially other countries near Germany in Europe. I don't know my geography of Europe that well at all, but I'm pretty sure that France, who's experienced a uh, pretty high infection rate and a fairly high rate of mortality, borders Germany. If anybody wants to correct me on that, please feel free. I should probably have printed a map or something. But how is it that countries that are in such close proximity, and both of which, by the way, have been hit with pretty high numbers of people getting the virus, and yet there can be such a huge difference in the rate of mortality? I think I pointed out that as of yesterday's figures, Germany had 2.1% mortality and Italy had 12.7%. Now, Italy and Germany don't border one another as far as I know, but they're close. They're within the same general region. So what's with that huge of a difference? Well, I managed to find some information. This is from the New York Times, and it was published April 4th. And I'm not going to read the entire story, but the highlights of it that I was able to find is that the reason for the difference can be broken down into several basic categories. First of all, there was the testing in Germany. In mid-January, long before most Germans had given the virus much thought, Charité Hospital in Berlin had already developed a test and posted the formula online. By the time Germany recorded its first case of COVID-19 in February, laboratories across the country had built up a stockpile of test kits. The reason why we in Germany have so few deaths at the moment compared to the number of infected can be largely explained by the fact that we are doing an extremely large number of lab diagnoses, said Dr. Christian Drosten, chief virologist at Charité, whose team developed the first test. By now, Germany is conducting, and again, this is by April 4th, Germany was conducting 350,000 coronavirus tests per week, far more than any other European country. Early and widespread testing has allowed the authorities to slow the spread of the pandemic by isolating known cases while they are infectious. It has also enabled life-saving treatment to be administered in a more timely way. There's also another factor, the factor of tracking. In most countries, including the United States, testing is largely limited to the sickest patients, so a person who was ordered to take a test in Germany, it says here, On a Friday in late February, Professor Streeck received news that for the first time, a patient at his hospital in Bonn had tested positive for the coronavirus. A 22-year-old man who had no symptoms, but whose employer, a school, had asked him to take a test after learning that he had taken part in a carnival event where someone else had tested positive. In most countries, including the United States, testing is largely limited to the sickest patients, so this man probably would have been refused a test under the same conditions in the United States. But not so in Germany. As soon as the test results were in, the school was shut and all children and staff were ordered to stay at home with their families for 2 weeks. Quote, testing and tracking is the strategy that was successful in South Korea, and we have tried to learn from that, said this professor. Also credited for the low mortality rate is a robust public healthcare system in Germany. Before the coronavirus pandemic swept across Germany, university hospitals in Gießen had 173 intensive care beds equipped with ventilators. In recent week, the hospital scrambled to create an additional 40 beds and increase the staff that was already on standby to work in intensive care by as much as 50%. We have so much capacity now, we are accepting patients from Italy, Spain, and France, said Suzanne Harold, a specialist in lung infections at the hospital who has overseen the restructuring. Quote, we are very strong in the intensive care area. And then another factor which is being credited is a broad trust in government. Beyond mass testing and preparedness of the healthcare system, many also see Chancellor Angela Merkel's leadership as one reason the fatality rate has been kept low. Ms. Merkel, a trained scientist, has communicated clearly, calmly, and regularly throughout the crisis, as she imposed ever stricter social distancing measures on the country. The restrictions, which have been crucial to slowing the spread of the pandemic, met with little political opposition and are broadly followed. Okay. That explains the slowing of the spread, but I don't know. That last paragraph, to my point of view, doesn't exactly examine the real point of the article, which is why is their mortality so low? As far as I can tell, they're still being hit with a lot of cases of the virus. Mitigation is intended to slow the spread of the virus. Mitigation doesn't necessarily equate to keeping people who are sick from dying. We keep hearing people say that as of right now, other than some testing, some preliminary testing of COVID-19 drugs such as hydroxychloroquine, etc., we don't have an effective treatment for this. All right, so trust in government doesn't necessarily mean that people who are sick are not going to pass away. It just means that the population of Germany trusts the government more and trusts them to the extent that they're willing to voluntarily abide by the mitigation methods. So there's an attempt at explaining the low mortality rate. There's a lot of information there, and there's a lot we still just don't know. So I still haven't really dug into what's going on in Swedish, Norwegian, Finnish, Danish, the Scandinavian countries, where I understand some of the people who commented yesterday were wondering what it was that those countries were doing that was so different than what was going on in other parts of the world, and they still were not getting hit with very, very staggering numbers. So that's probably something I'm going to look into later for a later broadcast. But these particular concepts were things that I felt deserved some speculation, especially with what's going on in China. So, yeah. How possible is it the coronavirus has been here in the United States longer than we thought? Has that resulted in a sort of inadvertent herd immunity, like I've been talking about a couple times since I began doing these things? And what's going on in Germany? I'm beginning to develop a couple sort of conspiracy theories that I'm going to keep to myself. I don't want to get up here and just start talking tinfoil hat wearing nonsense, but there are a number of things about this whole pandemic that don't pass the common sense checks. And when I find something that doesn't make sense, I want to try to make sense of it. And I'm continuing to do reading and just looking into it on my own. And there are a couple connections that my mind has started to make, and there's a couple suspicions that have popped into my brain. And I'm continuing to follow them just sort of on my own time. And if I find anything that really just glaringly points to something that I think everyone should think about, then you can rest assured I'll talk about it here. But as yet, they're just theories, daydreams, fictitious mostly. But, sometimes a crazy idea gets in your head and you know it's a crazy idea. You know it's silly. And it's kind of fun to think about it. But sometimes you just don't lose it. It doesn't disappear from your brain. It doesn't go away. And in fact, you keep finding things that make it more and more and more, I should say, less and less and less a fantasy, right? So I'm going to keep on those tracks. If anybody wants to throw anything out there, I'd be happy to read your idea here on the stream. But I'm going to withhold my own for right now. And tomorrow I'll be a little bit more specific with local figures. I'm not going to worry about that today. I am going to quickly shift gears away from the coronavirus topic, though. Yesterday, I mentioned here that I wanted to take the telescope out and find some spot outside of the city where I could set up the scope and where I could view the Great Nebula in Orion. We're losing time in the year for that to be a viable possibility, because by the time the sun goes down, Orion is really low in the southwestern sky. And by the time it's completely dark and all the twilight has finally disappeared, parts of the constellation of Orion, I think, have already begun to set below the western horizon. So I took advantage of this last couple days, took advantage of the fact that the moon, being a couple days past full, didn't rise until just short of 10:30, and I took the telescope all the way down to the area of Centralia and Chehalis. The first spot where I set up was near in fact, right next to the runway of the Centralia Chehalis Airport, next to a golf club. That proved to not be an ideal place. The region of the sky where I was pointing the scope to observe Orion was not obstructed and there was no light pollution, but directly to my left was the runway of a small airport and tons of light. So I stayed there for about an hour observing Orion, and I did a little observing in the constellation of Gemini. I used my iPhone to see if there were any deep sky objects, galaxies, star cluster, nebula in Gemini that I didn't know about, and turns out there were. So I stayed there for a little while, but then eventually I decided, hey, maybe I can find some better spot away from this airport. So I drove a little further, and I found a town that I didn't know existed called Adna. It's about 61 miles away from here, and I found a parking lot by the head of a hiking trail. By this time, it's already about 10 o'clock at night. It's completely dark, and I'm away from any lights. And so it made for some pretty good observing. So I actually saw a lot more than I thought I was going to see. What did I observe last night? Well, I started with the Orion Nebula, of course. Planet Venus was up. It still looks like a very obvious crescent shape through the telescope. Very bright, so bright that if you have a lunar filter to attach to your eyepiece, that'll definitely help. I looked at the Pleiades, M45, that open star cluster in Taurus, and then I found a couple of new objects that I had never viewed before. And I thought that springtime viewing was going to be kind of boring. Like I said, I'm really used to observing summer constellations like Sagittarius and Scorpius, Hercules, etc. And I didn't know how much I was missing. There's actually a lot of things to find in the spring sky. So I looked in the constellations of Orion, in Taurus, in Leo, and in Gemini last night. That's where I did the most of my observing. So what I was able to find, starting in Gemini, there is a gorgeous open star cluster in Gemini called M35, which is actually pretty easy to find. It's an open cluster, but it's not like the Pleiades. It actually looks like a very loose globular cluster. It seems to have a sort of spheroid shape. It is just the stars are not very close to each other like they would be in a globular cluster. There's also a planetary nebula. That's a not a supernova remnant, but a nova remnant. It appears as just a little smoke ring of gas. It's NGC 2392. I think it was called the Eskimo Nebula, because if you have really high magnification and time exposure, the details of that nebula have a certain shape. I might be wrong about that, but it is technically designated as NGC 2392, a planetary nebula. Then in Leo, there are actually 4 Messier objects, galaxies, all of them in the constellation of Leo: M96, M105, M65, and M66. And I saw all of them last night. So last night I saw no less than, well, if you include M42 and M43 and Orion, I saw 7 Messier objects. Well, I guess 8 if you include the Pleiades. So yeah, just nerding out with the telescope about an hour outside of town last night, and that was actually a lot of fun. You know, I wanted to try to bring people along, but in fact, it probably worked out better that I didn't take anyone with me, because I got to linger on each object for as long as I wanted to. I didn't have to worry that I was boring my companion with a bunch of geeky shit. And I got to essentially do the whole thing on my own terms. And I stayed out until I saw the moon rise over the horizon. It happened at around, I want to say, 10:26 p.m. And I saw it, first of all, I didn't see it creep over the horizon because there was a line of trees on top of this ridge. So my first view of the moon was through a bunch of trees off in the distance, and then it crept up over the horizon. And by the time it was all the way up, it was outshining pretty much everything in the eastern sky, and it was only going to get worse. So then it was time to come home. So that was what I did with myself yesterday, or rather last night. Yesterday, I took Eddie for a walk that lasted, I want to say, like 3 hours. I just headed north from the Hilltop neighborhood, and found myself at a park up towards Point Defiance that I didn't know existed, called Puget Creek. And it's just one of these areas where if you're driving along on Proctor Street, you go over a bridge, and all you see from the vantage of the bridge is trees. What you don't know is that it drops down probably at least 150 feet, and there's just this gorge that's cut out. And that's where this park was. You just find a path and it zigzags down to the bottom of it. And I didn't know it was there. My roommates here didn't know it was there, but it's a beautiful park up in the north end. I actually got a glimpse of Mount Baker. I wish I had my binoculars with me, but yeah, it was very obvious and clear, although very distant. Um, and so were a lot of the other peaks in the North Cascades. So it was a beautiful day for a walk yesterday. I was also hoping to do that today, except there's a lot of haze on the horizon. You can't even see the nearby Cascades, so there's not going to be much point in doing that today. So, but yeah, that's just kind of examples of what I'm doing with myself during this quarantine, just walking and looking at the sky. So I'm just going to leave things there for now. Wow, 28 minutes of broadcasting. That's more than I expected to do today. So real quick, let me take a look at some of these comments and share anything interesting that you guys have shared before I sign off. Just a second. Okay. My friend Graham, did you check out Sweden at all since yesterday, and how are they handling it? No, Graham, I haven't, not yet. But Graham also says that he used to live 10 to 20 kilometers south in Bad Nauheim, where Elvis lived when he was stationed over in Germany. So, all right, thanks for sharing that. I have not yet checked out Sweden or any of the other Scandinavian countries or studied their mitigation efforts as yet. I will make a pointed effort to have information to discuss about that tomorrow. Have you read anything about the potential reinfection issues with COVID-19? Like we may not be completely immune after recovery. I haven't done any direct reading about it, although I have heard certain commentators refer to things that they have found out. That, for instance, there's a phlebotomist, I think somewhere in California, that does something like 400 tests a day, and some of the results that she is seeing in her tests are suggestive that, as I mentioned a while ago, the coronavirus may have already been rampant in California long before we were strictly aware of it, and that she is seeing people with high antibody counts and that they have not gotten sick again since the country went on this emergency status that we're on right now. So I tend to think that if a person has gotten sick from COVID-19, whether or not they were aware of it or got tested and got over it, that their body has developed antibodies and that they would be immune from reinfection. That seems to be the general trend of the information that I'm getting. I don't have any specific references that I can cite, but that tends to be my thinking on it. Also, from Graham, we've talked about the Oregon Star Party, right? Usually happens in or around July. The telescopes people bring are insane. I would observe Einstein's Cross. You would love it. Happens annually around Bend in the National Forest. That's worth looking at. If we have a season of public star parties this year, I would make a pointed effort to attend that as well. So, thanks, Graham, for contributing so much to today's stream. And I'm going to leave things there for now. Everybody, stay safe and be good to each other.